Alright, well I'm really excited today about the project that I've got here for you. We're making a needle sewing book. It's got a wonderful little button ribbon closure and will help you store all of your needles in it. I know I always have trouble trying to keep track of where all my sewing needles are, and making this has been extremely helpful. I'm really excited to share it with you, and so now that you've seen the project, let's get going. Alright, so for this project, what you're going to need is a sheet of felt, a scrap of fabric, or you can use a quilter square, a piece of ribbon, a button, needle, thread, pins, scissors, a piece of dowel or a paintbrush or something to help us turn out the corners, and your pattern. You can use the one that I've provided, or you can create your own. It's going to be a rectangle that's 4 inches long, 4 inches high, by 7 inches long. So now that we have all of our materials, let's get started. All right, so lay out your fabric so that it's flat, and then you're also going to lay your felt on top of that. Now we're going to pin the pattern to the felt and the fabric so that it doesn't move as we go to cut it. I generally just do the corners since this is small and they're flat seams. All right, now that you've got it pinned, you're going to want to cut this out. Okay, now we can put our scissors to the side. So next we're going to unpin the pattern from the fabric. And we're going to set that to the side so we can reference it. Now on the pattern, as you can see, this mark tells us where our ribbon is going to be. So we're going to want to make sure that we put that in here when we go to sew it. So I'm going to take my ribbon, and like I said, we want this to act as a loop to go over our button to close it. So I'm going to make sure that my ribbon loops and comes together flat like this. Now you might think that to sew it we want it here, like this, but really since we want it to be on the outside, we're going to want to sew it in like this, but we're going to want to sandwich it between the two layers. So I'm going to get our ribbon in there, and now so it doesn't move, I'm going to pin it in place. There. Now since we're sewing this inside out and we're going to be able to want to turn it right side out, we're going to leave a little gap from our sewing so we have room to turn it. I'm going to leave that gap over on this other end. So I'm going to mark that with 2 pins. You might want a gap about 1 inch apart, or you might want to do it a little wider if you're not used to turning things inside out. Now I'm going to pin the rest of this to make sure my fabric doesn't move as I go to sew it. Alright, now that we've got it pinned and our ribbon in the right spot, we're going to go to the sewing machine. Okay, now I'm going to make sure I start at one side where the pin is for the gap so that I can sew the entire circumference and end over here. That way I don't have to do as many seams. So our seam allowance is a 1/2 inch, so I'm going to make sure that's how much I do all the way around. So let's go. And then we'll trim our thread. For this next step, we're going to need our scissors again. See, now we have all of our edges done, but we have too much ribbon here that we don't need inside, and we're going to want to trim the corners so that they turn properly. So I'm going to take my scissors, and I'm going to cut a triangle off all of the corners. This makes sure that our corners will be nice and pointed once we're done. Now I'm also going to get rid of this extra ribbon. Perfect. So this is what it'll look like before you turn it inside out. Now to do that, you're going to want to take your opening and just start pushing the fabric through it. You can do most of this by hand, but once you get to the corners, you might find that having like a paintbrush end or a pencil or some kind of a dowel will help you really get those corners. Alright, so now it looks like this. So as you can see, we're going to be able to turn it like this and hook that around our button. Now, if you have an iron, you're going to want to go ahead and iron this flat. If you don't, it's okay. That step really for this project is optional. So as you can see, we still have this opening here, and we're going to want to sew that closed. So how I'm going to do this is we're going to sew what's called a top stitch all around the top. That's also going to help keep our fabric flat in case you didn't iron it already. So let's go back to the sewing machine. Okay, so now that we have all of the top stitching and sewing for this done, it's almost completely finished. We just need that button closure. So for the button, you're definitely going to want to use a hand needle and thread for this, as especially this type of button our machines can't do for us. So go ahead and get that ready, and we'll check our pattern to see where we need to sew it in place. Okay, now that we have our thread on our needle, let's double check our pattern. So the pattern we might have to adjust from in case our ribbon moved. So you can go by the pattern and look where that button marker was, or what might even be easier is just fold it over and look and see where your button needs to go. But make sure you don't shift it too much when you go to flatten this back out. So now let's sew our button in place. Some people really don't want to see their thread when they do this, and they try to do it all in between the layers. I don't mind for this project, so you can go straight through both layers. It's really a personal preference at this point. Since these don't get as much wear as, say, a pair of pants, you don't have to do as many loops around the button as you would otherwise. I do about 4 or 5, and then I go ahead and knot this off. There we go. And then we'll trim the extra thread. There we go. Now your button's on. So you should now be able to fold this over and secure it closed. You've now made your very own sewing needle book. All you have to do now is fill it with needles. And you can start with the one we just used. So there you go.